May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. If I was going to pick a catchphrase for my husband, if I was going to write him into a sitcom, it would probably be, perspective is an interesting thing. The first time he said this to me was in the middle of, we'll call it a heated discussion, where we both voiced different perspectives on a situation, and he calmly told me that perspective was an interesting thing, and it really cheesed me off. Since then, he uses it on a pretty regular basis, and when we're not disagreeing, I do see the validity in his statement. Now, one of my favorite guilty pleasures, a genuine time suck, so I'm not encouraging you to go down this rabbit hole, is reading the AITA Reddits. AITA is an acronym for, we're going to replace the word with jerk. Basically, people write in online situations that they think they're right in. Someone else in this situation, or sometimes a handful of people, have told them that they were being a jerk in this situation, and so where else do you turn but you crowdsource it to the internet to see what everyone thinks of your situation. Now, there are 4 answers to these Reddits. You can say, yep, you're a jerk. You can say, nope, you're not a jerk, but the people you're around sure are. You can declare that nobody is a jerk in this situation and you all just need to communicate better. Or my personal favorite situation, you're all jerks. Now, I sit down every morning with my coffee and I read these stories and I find them mind-blowing on many levels, not the least of which that people put them out on the internet for all to weigh in on. Like, how do you as a bride scream at a teenager in your wedding party who has cancer because her lack of hair now will ruin your wedding photos? Mind-blowing, right? Okay. Or, how do you get mad at a friend and tell him he is wildly inappropriate because he carried his stepmother up 5 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken and she had just had a C-section? So I, of course, not only read these, but then I impart them to my husband because they are just too good to not share. And he regularly responds with his average catchphrase, perspective is an interesting thing. It gets me thinking about that lovely banner we have out front that says, love your neighbors, no exception. This is a wildly popular banner in Olney. It gets posted onto various Olney Facebook pages on a regular basis. People appreciate the message we're sending. And my guess is that if I asked you to raise your hand, I'm not going to, and ask if you really try to live by that mantra, my guess is a lot of hands would shoot up in this room. If I asked you to keep your hand up and then I asked you all to look around at all the people who had their hands up, though, I have a guess that people might look around and have some stories about the people with their hands up that might undermine their own perspective on how well they're living out the banner. Because love is a tough word. Do I love my children? Absolutely, every day. Do I hide from my children in my backyard because if I hear mommy, mommy, mommy like they are the seagulls from Finding Nemo one more time, I'm going to lose my mind? I might do that on a daily basis this summer. Love of neighbor is even harder. Because what does love even mean? Is loving your neighbor just not being annoying? We love one another through indifference. Is love being nice? Is it a do no harm mantra? Is it actively trying to be in relationship with absolutely everyone I encounter? Because that seems kind of exhausting and annoying. I like it. Often, we default to love of neighbor in a do no harm capacity. If I don't actively hurt you, if we interact and I try really hard to not land on the AITA Reddit, I'm doing my part to love my neighbor and I'm just going to go live my life. But see, perspective is an interesting thing. So in our gospel today, the lawyer comes and he tries to get Jesus to say to him, "You're on it. You're doing good enough. You can recite the law, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. Love your neighbor as yourself." In the same way, we maybe can point to the banner out front and say, "Love your neighbor, no exceptions. There you go. I'm doing my best." That is enough. But wanting to be sure, wanting his position securely justified by Jesus, he asks about God's perspective on the matter. "Who is my neighbor?" he asks. Now, Jesus, never being easy with these things, instead of answering the question, tells him a story. There's a guy. He's robbed and left for dead. 3 people pass by. Now, let's just take this at its baseline. There's a beaten guy on the road. Considering the context, you passing by could still be in danger. Robbers could still be near, and traveling, especially in ancient times, was sincerely a dangerous endeavor. Towns are far apart, there is no suburban sprawl, and all 3 travelers are traveling alone. They therefore have very justified fear of what happens to them if they choose to stop. Related to this is you got to ask yourself the question, why is this guy beaten on the side of the road in the first place? They didn't see it happen. They don't know he's been robbed. They have no idea what kind of guy they're getting in the mix with. Was he a bad guy? Did he somehow deserve it? They could be helping a criminal and putting themselves in danger. That seems like a pretty big ask. And finally, there's some pretty big purity issues involved, especially for a priest and a Levite. Blood means, any contact with blood at all means that you have become defiled. It would take ritual and time to correct this defilement. So here's a stranger, side of the road, puts me in danger, possibly will defile me, maybe he's a criminal himself. Is he worth stopping for? And 2 people say, no. Now there's a third guy. This is a Samaritan, which is a very interesting category of person for Jesus to name. Samaritans were both insiders and outsiders to the Jewish people because they were monotheistic. They were a part of the Abrahamic faith. But unlike the high holy fellows that came before him, who one would assume would help, but have a lot of reasons in the law to justify not, the Samaritan is the most likely to be apathetic to the situation. Not his circus, not his monkeys, not his people. He has business to do. And yet, not only does he stop, but he is moved with pity, Jesus says. Now, instead of being motivated by rules or by shoulds, the Samaritan is motivated by the workings of his heart. He uses his own supplies for the journey to bandage the man's wounds on the spot. He walks the rest of the journey, however far that may be, to the next town, because he has to place the man on his animal. He leaves money then at the innkeeper to continue to care for the man, and then promises the innkeeper that he will pay any additional expenses, thereby leaving himself open to fraud, because the innkeeper could come back with any number saying that this is what he had to spend to take care of the man. So the Samaritan not only stops, not only helps, but is thoroughly inconvenienced by this encounter. Now, Jesus doesn't end with like a therefore, this is how you do it to the lawyer. And instead, his therefore is actually just a reframing of the question. If you remember, the question the man asked was, who is my neighbor? Which passively asks, which level of circle am I required to care about in my interactions? Jesus instead makes the moral of the story a changed question. Who was a neighbor to the man? Jesus changes the question to a question that gives full agency to the question asker. Are we being neighbors? Rather than, are you my neighbor? Have I claimed you as my neighbor? Or have I decided you're not worth my time or inconvenience? In God's perspective, we aren't justified in how we are defining the other, our neighbor, but is in how we are choosing to define ourselves in relationship with that person. If I decide that I am everyone's neighbor, then I will treat everyone accordingly, rather than requiring that other people find their way to finding themselves in that category of circle that I would claim as my neighbor then. So a couple months ago, my son had a wrestling/trampoline accident, and he really desperately needed to go to the ER and get stitches. But at the time, I had my two youngest children with me as well, and my husband was still at work in Bethesda, and I needed help because I was not taking all three of them to the ER. So I called upon a neighbor and friend who was in the middle of tutoring, which is one of the things she does for extra income, so it's 100% part of her job. And she took in my two daughters without hesitation or anything, just brought them in her house. And I know she was put out an inconvenience because I have tried to work with my two youngest children before in the house, and I know what that is like. And yet, she treated them with the care she would hope her own children would receive in such an emergency. Now, I know her, and she's a friend of mine. But we got to ask ourselves the question, if it was just the new neighbor who came by the door, moved in 2 days ago, never have met me, and she knocked on my door and said, my son had an accident, I have to go to the ER, and I have smaller children, please will you watch them? Would I claim her as my neighbor enough to bring her in and treat her with the same respect that a friend and neighbor who knows me well treated me? Despite its exhausting nature, the perspective on the banner isn't meant to be, I think I'm trying to do this, I'll do this good enough for people I interact with, but instead it's actually God's perspective of, are you actively making everyone your neighbor? Love isn't doing no harm. Love isn't apathy. Love is actually an active attempt to build relationship and bridges, to put ourselves out for people that we may never know if they were ever worthy of our inconvenience. Therefore, love isn't cleaning out our pantries and closets to give the needy our cast-off or leftovers or that which we do not need, but is actually buying groceries or coats or clothes off of those lists of the most needed and most taken items, which may mean additional trips to the grocery store I wasn't planning on or additional hits in my budget that I hadn't planned for, to make sure those in need get what they need and not just what I'm willing to give. Love isn't just helping out friends when they tell us something is wrong, but it's actually seeking out places of need, of making those people our neighbors. From the local schools to the church to nonprofits. It is doing the work that people need us to be doing, based not on our convenience, but on what we have to give. Love isn't just thoughts and prayers, but it is as often as possible getting our hands and our feet into the work of answering those prayers. Even when it makes us stop, do something else, get out of our way, spend money we didn't want to spend, take time we didn't think we had. Perspective is an interesting thing. Love God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. And we ask God, but who is my neighbor? And God responds back with God's perspective. Who are you making your neighbor? Go and make neighbors. Amen.